Ever really thought about what it takes to get a plane ready for a flight? I mean, it's a lot more than just fueling it up and kicking the tires. How a plane is loaded is all about physics and safety. And, getting it wrong, well, that can have some really serious consequences. So let's get into the critical science of aircraft weight and balance.
I mean, we've all done this, right? You're going on a road trip, you just cram everything into the car without a second thought. But this quote, it points out a huge misconception. Applying that same just pack it and go logic to an airplane isn't just a bad idea, it's incredibly dangerous. A plane is a totally different beast.
So let's try to think about this differently. What if every single passenger, every piece of luggage, every gallon of fuel had to be placed just right? Like you're trying to keep a giant seesaw perfectly level? Well, that's pretty much the reality for a pilot. And that's the core idea we're going to dig into.
All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll talk about why a plane is definitely not a flying car. Then we'll dive into the physics of finding its balance point and the heavy price for being overweight. We'll even look at the math pilots do before every flight, see what happens when that balance is off, and we'll wrap up with the pilot's ultimate responsibility in all of this.
Okay, let's jump right into that first point. The way you load your car might, affect your gas mileage a little bit? The way you load a plane? Well, that affects pretty much everything, including whether it could even get off the ground in the first place.
I mean, look at the difference here. The stakes are just on a completely different level. In your car, if you're overloaded, you might have a bumpy ride. In a plane, being overloaded or loaded improperly directly messes with the pilot's ability to control the aircraft. It literally changes how the machine behaves in the air.
And that brings us right to the heart of it all, finding that perfect balance. See, it's not just about the total weight you're carrying. It's about where every single ounce of that weight is located inside the plane. That's the key.
So the term you're going to hear a lot is the center of gravity, or CG for short. The easiest way to think about it is as the invisible pivot point for the entire airplane. If you could somehow magically hang the whole plane from that one single point, it would just balance perfectly level. Everything about flying revolves around managing where this CG is.
And honestly, this is the best way to get it. We all get how a seesaw works, right? You can have two people with totally different weights, and they can balance it out perfectly just by shifting where they sit. An airplane works on the exact same principle, just, on a much, much bigger and more complicated scale.
On that seesaw, the fulcrum is that obvious metal thing in the middle. Well, the plane's center of gravity is doing the exact same job as that fulcrum, but it's invisible, it's floating in the air, and, this is the tricky part, its location moves with every single passenger who gets on and every bag that gets loaded.
To figure all this out, pilots use a concept called a moment. A moment is basically the twisting or rotational force that any weight creates. The math is simple. It's just the item's weight multiplied by its distance, or what pilots call its arm, from a set reference point. And that's why a small 10-pound bag way in the back of the plane can have a surprisingly huge impact on the overall balance.
Okay, so before we even get back to the balance part, what happens if the plane is just plain too heavy? I'm talking about exceeding the maximum weight it's designed for. This is what's known as the weight penalty, and its consequences are felt through every single phase of flight.
During takeoff, all that extra weight means you need way more speed and a much longer runway to get off the ground. Sometimes, it might even be impossible to take off at all. Once you're cruising, a heavy aircraft can't fly as high or as far, and the engines have to work overtime just guzzling fuel. And then when it's time to land, the approach has to be faster, the brakes struggle, and you've got a real risk of running right off the end of the runway.
So how do pilots keep this from happening? Well, they sure don't guess. Before every single flight, they do a crucial weight and balance calculation to make absolutely sure the aircraft is under its weight limit and properly balanced.
And the process is pretty straightforward, conceptually. First, the pilot lists literally everything that has weight. The pilot, the passengers, the fuel, every piece of cargo. Next, they note the location, or arm, for each one of those items. Then they do that little multiplication we talked about to get the moment for each one. And finally, they add it all up, all the weights and all the moments, to find that critical final center of gravity.
And here's a really simple idea of what that looks like on paper. You can see each item, pilot, passenger, fuel, has its own weight and its own arm. Multiply those two, and you get the moment. The totals at the bottom give the pilot the two numbers they absolutely need. First is the total weight okay, and second, by dividing the total moment by the total weight, they can pinpoint the exact location of the plane's center of gravity. But let's say the total weight is perfectly fine. What happens if that center of gravity is in the wrong place?
This is, without a doubt, one of the most dangerous situations a pilot can find themselves in because it strikes at the very heart of their ability to control the plane.
So, if the CG is too far forward, the plane gets really nose-heavy. The controls feel sluggish, like you're flying through mud, and it's tough to get the nose up for takeoff or to flare for a gentle landing. Now, if the CG is too far aft, that's even worse. The plane becomes tail-heavy, which means it's twitchy and unstable. The controls are way too sensitive, and the most dangerous part? If you get into a stall, recovering can be incredibly difficult or, in a worst-case scenario, literally impossible.
So, all of this really brings us to the final, and maybe most important point. The physics, the math, it's all pretty clear-cut. The real challenge is the human element, having the discipline to do this right every single time without fail.
This quote just nails it. For a pilot, learning how to do the calculations isn't the hardest part. The real fight is against complacency. It's fighting that little voice that says, you've done this 100 times, you can skip it this once. That discipline, that's what separates a safe flight from a potential disaster.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. We always focus on the dramatic parts of flying, right? The takeoff, the landing. But after all this, you have to ask yourself, could it be that the most important part of any flight is actually the quiet, careful math that a pilot does on the ground long before the engines even start?